You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Creating Your Encore Career. This is episode number 99, and it's about how I created my first webinar with the help of Rick Davis, and we'll have a great conversation with Rick. My goal is to help you create a compelling future for yourself in an encore career, or as I'd like to say, become a silver entrepreneur. I'll also share ideas on how companies connect with the talent that you provide for them and thereby create value for both the organization and for you. I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode and use that as a tool to capture notes or ideas as you explore the concepts in this episode. Well, today we're going to be talking with Rick Davis, a good friend and teacher who helped me prepare for my first webinar. We're going to pull back the curtain and show you how a webinar gets made and how Rick guided me in building my story and skills to create my first webinar. Rick describes himself as a presentation specialist and a playful otter. He's got a great sense of humor. He helps people become engaging presenters, prepped and ready for any occasion. Now, he works with speakers, coaches, executives, sales professionals, and anyone with a desire to perform better whenever they are speaking in public or at private functions. So some of the questions we're going to discuss today are Rick and the work that he does, explained in his own words, the journey that Rick and I went on building the webinar, how he helped me use story for the presentation, how he helped me focus on the audience, even when being virtual. And then as a bonus, Rick is going to share some key tips on networking for you. Rick is a pleasure to work with, and I know you'll enjoy this conversation with him. Welcome to Rick Davis on the podcast. And Rick, I'd like to just start off by you describe yourself and the work you do.
I am a presentation specialist and playful otter. That is the two things that I am all about, Lynn. So I like to help people in their presentations, whatever they may be, any kind of public speaking that people do, whether it's a formal speech, a keynote, a workshop, a team meeting at a corporate environment, or even just networking and communicating with each other. I help people find ways to make it easier for themselves so their audience gets more out of what they do. So just it's all about the audience and what we can do for them. But I do it as fun and as loose and just conversational as possible. I know speaking is a challenge for a lot of people. So my job is to put them at ease as much as possible and give them confidence to show them, you got this. It may seem challenging and like anything else, it does take practice, but there are a lot of speakers who hold themselves back from delivering awesome results for their audience just because they think they're not a good speaker when in fact they usually are.
And you have a really interesting background that gets you to this place that I've always found very helpful. And also it's just great that you do it.
Yeah, my background is performance. So a lot of professional entities and environments that really fine-tuned the reason why I do what I do now. So I started in stand-up comedy right out of high school and then started doing professional improv comedy, professional theater, and then a lot of on-camera and voiceover work. And so you name it, I've done. Game show host. I've done a lot of different things. And all of them have given me different tool sets to use. And I love presenting because it's such a way to help people in a different way. And I'm able to take my professional world from performance and apply it to the professional world in presentations to really help people stand out from the average and boring speakers.
And while our work together was around a webinar, I've certainly worked with you in other venues. And I always remember, too, how in a short presentation you made for an entrepreneurial group, you talked about how you actually move on the stage. That's something I'd never even considered before. And you gave us some of the ideas and reasons for that. So that was really stretched my thinking about, okay, that's something I could or should pay attention to. Although in the last year, most of what we've done is virtual. But
Yeah, it all makes a difference. And even looking at a camera can make a difference. Just the way we look at somebody in the virtual space, it all comes into play. There's just all these subconscious things in our brains that go on and how we perceive something as humans which make a difference in our message. So that's what I try to help people understand.
Great. As far as our work together, I asked you to help me present a webinar. It was my first online webinar. And while I've done many years of presenting, I'm also an engineer and I tend to make dry presentations sometimes. So, and I tend to be very linear in my presentations. So you helped me and we walked through a whole process. And I wondered if you could think about what are the steps that you actually had me go through to help me improve that presentation.
Yeah. So we got together back in, I'd say mid to late February is when we first started. And you had this dream of doing this webinar. And I love that. I mean, I think it's such a useful tool, especially for what you're doing in your business. I think it's going to help a lot of people, but we just found out where you were and what you wanted to do. And from there, I usually come up with an itinerary of what I think makes sense for your end goal. So I always ask my clients and people I work with, what is it that you want your audience to take away? And we covered that like in 4 or 5 different times in different ways. I would always ask you, we would work weeks apart and I'd come back to what is it you want your audience to take away? And you always had a solid answer and you knew the vision of what you wanted and where you wanted to take them. And that's what we worked on. So we always start with a process of story. I like to use what I call the SSRS system. And that's starting with a story because story is such a good hook. It's personal and it makes us more interested in what you have to share because it's something we haven't heard before. So when we can share a personal story, that's even better. Sometimes it's not personal. Sometimes it's about a famous person or a historical figure or something like that we can share that makes sense for what we're doing. But usually those personal stories make sense. And you had a great one. Yeah, I don't know if you want to share just a little bit about the story that we ended up using, but it's such a good one to use for what we needed for your audience.
Sure. And it was a pivotal moment for me. Had a good career, long career, and I wanted to move into more of, I'll say, a learning and development type role. And then the pivotal moment in the story is when I didn't get a position I was hoping for. And a person said, well, this is a developmental position, Lynn. And to me, that was, well, it's like, I'm too old to develop. What's the deal here? There were probably other reasons I didn't get it. But for me, that meant, okay, how do I move forward? And which is what I've done now. It's after I retired, now I've started my own business working on helping other people. And it was one of those things, but you really helped me think through that story. And the other piece is I had the story inside me, but I had never found a way to express it very well. You had to really work on me because sometimes it was hard for me to draw that out or articulate maybe the emotions I felt, things like that. I could just tell the facts. I'm good at that, but you really helped me convey to people, how I felt about the whole thing.
Yeah. And if you recall, we started with expanding more of all the stories you had. So we started in like some childhood stuff and kind of in your teenage years and then in your younger years, just of college and all that kind of stuff. And then chronologically made it through wherever we could go to where you ended up with what your audience needed. It's my job to listen to you and where things are clicking for your audience, because that's one of my superpowers is knowing what an audience would want. Being a performer with so many years, I kind of know where most audiences would want to go, and knowing who your audience is and what they are looking for. As soon as you shared this story, that one really clicked for me in my ears. And I thought, this is the one we need to fine tune and really hone in on for your audience, because it's such a great story. And you're right. It's one of those stories for you where you wanted something, you couldn't get it because somebody had control over you, a power over you, or something that was out of your control. And then you made a decision and then things turned out great. That's a story arc of many great stories, whether it's Star Wars or any of the epic movies that we watch. That's exactly what happens in a hero's journey. And that's what we're trying to get at for you and your audience.
Yeah, I remember the process is that before we got to that story, as you said, you had me talk through a lot of them and you really stretched my thinking as each of those steps, as I described different stories, as you tried to have me flesh them out and make them more alive and make them more real. And by the time I got to that one, I was starting to get it. wasn't all the way there, but I was starting to get it.
It's hard for us to think about our stories because we're used to them. they happen to us and we just kind of forget them. Once we've done it, we don't need to think about them anymore. There's certain things that happen. Maybe we have an experience that was remarkable in some fashion, whether it's good or bad. But for most of us, we forget a lot of the things that actually make us who we are. And as you were telling me a lot more of your story, there were some things that I wanted to learn more about you and I didn't know. And it was great to hear about a lot of those things because it just told me more about who you are as a person. And one thing we kept going back to was the meaning of the story. Like, what does it mean for you and your audience? And I think that's where a lot of people get caught up is, yeah, it happens, but there's no meaning. There's usually meaning in everything we do after we look back on it and reflect on it and just take whatever lessons we can.
It's one of those things that it probably has meaning and richness and color in my head, but then actually sharing that with somebody takes some effort sometimes. So in listening to other people's stories, just like you, I'm intrigued by what they have to say about those things and what it meant to them and those kinds of things. So it was that idea of you helping me understand what the audience might be interested in.
Yeah. And that's the second S of the SSRS is the significance, right? So those are the lessons we learn from the story that you're sharing and how it applies to the topic that we're going to talk about with our audience. And you managed to merge those things together very well in your webinar. And I thought you did a remarkable job of just tying the story that you shared. And we didn't dive into your story. Like, it wasn't one of those stories that was like an epic story. Like, oh man, you have to hear this story. It's a good story, but we don't have to focus on all the details that a lot of storytellers give, because in a webinar setting, we need to get to more of the content. And so you gave just enough of the story that we needed to hear with the meaning. And then you delivered more of the content and what it was all about. That's where the focus was. And I thought you did such a good job of making that happen for your audience instead of just really making the story the spotlight of your webinar. That was just like a feature, like, here's just one thing. Let's help you with this content I'm sharing. And I thought you did a really good job of that.
And then I know you have more steps in the process, but I just recall then as I got into the content of the webinar, there was innumerable places where you helped me, whether it be on pacing or whether I have images, those kinds of things that, again, probably my mindset from my corporate career was PowerPoint bullet points. And you helped me, at least in some fashion, step away from some of that.
Yeah, we do what we learn. We see everybody else doing stuff, and maybe we haven't been taught some other ways of approaching PowerPoint or any kind of slideshow. So if we can tweak it where it makes it a little bit easier for the audience to absorb, that's going to help our message resonate with them more. And they're going to be able to take more away from what we talk about. Instead of just one or two things, they're going to take away a lot more if we can fine tune it so it's something that makes sense in their brains. Like, simple is always better, right? You and I discussed that, where if we bog them down with too much stuff, then they get overloaded and they just can't take everything away that we'd want to share with them. So if we can make it simple and just maybe 3 or 4 things for our audience to remember, then they can always come back to us and ask, what else? I'm sure we can expand on one of these points, and you got more information I can learn from. What can you share with me? So that's the idea behind what we did. And you did an outstanding job.
And I appreciate that, because my tendency would be to overwhelm people. I love to share information, so I could just flood people with too much information, and you helped me tone that back. And I've seen that in other people's presentations where if they have a book or something like that, they want to teach the whole book in 45 minutes. And I know that doesn't work for me. And so you really helped me scale back and yet give a rich picture, but not too much of an epic movie in 40 minutes.
Right. It's tough because we want to help. And by helping, we do want to give everybody everything as much as we can. And it's tough to hold back on some things, but we're actually doing a better thing for our audience when we can only share just a few things that they are going to remember, instead of crowding them in so much stuff that they're just going to forget almost everything we share. So it's good to just share. I would say 3 to 5 is the good range. 3 is better, of course, but 5, if you need it, is okay. But any more than that, then we really start to lose a lot of the content that we're sharing.
Sure. So any other in your process there that you'd like to share that we went through?
Yeah, we have a story, significance, relevance is how it applies to the audience. So that's where we make the turn and say, this lesson, here's how it applies to you and how you can use it. So that's what we do with the significance. So we tell our story, we learn the lesson and the significance, and then the relevance is how it applies to our audience. And you did a great job in a lot of sections of your webinar where you were saying, so what this means to you is, and that statement alone is something that just makes a value effort for your audience outstanding because they hear, oh, this is for me. You are talking directly to me as you say those words. What this means to you is. That's something that a lot of presenters miss because we just deliver the lesson and leave it alone when we can say, okay, so here's the lesson. Here's how you can use this. Ears perk up, and then we take action on a lot more when we can tell them how it applies to them.
Yeah, and I always remember, too, you talked with me about, I remember this, even the slide, the Imagine This slide. And that was something that really sparked my attention because it was one of those things where it stretched my thinking, but also I think it helped the audience think about, oh, okay, this is what I could get if I can do these things. So that I was beyond just execute 4 steps or something like that. It was, this is what you might be feeling after you are able to execute those steps, those kinds of things.
And then that leads us into the final S, which is the support and getting your audience to take action on something that you're sharing with them. It could be a small thing or a big thing, but just get them involved in applying what you're doing in an exercise, in a discussion, anything you can do. And you nailed that in your slides on your webinar. You had them imagine what they could do and what life would be like. And we built in the offer for them to work with you so they could do more and learn more from the content that you were sharing. Lynn, I can't tell you how proud I am of you just to see the night and day difference from where you started to where you ended up. You did the work and you made it work because a lot of presenters just dabble and they'll think, oh, I'll get to it later and all that. Every time we met, you applied what we talked about and I could see your progress. Like I could virtually and literally see you progressing each week. And it was just such a cool thing to witness as a coach or a trainer or anybody who helps somebody in that environment. It's really heartwarming because they're listening and applying what we ask you to do. And we know it's going to make you better. And you certainly knocked it out of the park.
But I appreciate your support during that whole process because many times during the process, I felt uncomfortable and I wasn't getting it. Is this really working? And yet you were very supportive. And I'm still not a master at it, but it was that whole thing of I could get through the awkwardness. And it took time. I did spend a lot of time, as you said, on this, getting through that preparation, but it helped me really hone my message, articulate it for myself so that I could articulate it for others. But then all the insights you gave me about, I'll say, how to present and how to do those things, that was invaluable. Obviously, all of this is not just about this presentation. It's skills and knowledge I can carry forward in everything I do.
What would you say is one or maybe even a few of the challenges you had throughout the process? Like things you kept getting stuck on or things you're like, I'm not sure if this is working. Just from your perspective, what was some of the things that you're like, I'm not sure about this, Rick?
Telling a story. And that work was intriguing to me. On the other hand, when I actually started speaking out loud about the story, it was awkward and it was interesting. The other piece is I think I always had the whole presentation in front of me and I'm sitting there, am I getting anywhere on this? And we kept working on chunks of it. And you really helped me in that. Okay, this week I'm just focusing on this chunk. So that brought down the overwhelm with having to look at everything. The other thing that occurred to me was interesting as we went forward is in my corporate life, I always said people give way too many slides. And yet this was a webinar and it was a little different format. And you helped me say, well, you're only going to have one picture on this slide. You may have more slides. And so that was very intriguing and interesting. And it worked out beautifully. I hadn't thought of it that way as the whole visual piece of it. I knew that intellectually because I've read about that, but you actually brought it to life. This is how you use these visual images to really have people grab hold of the message that you're providing.
Awesome. That's good to know. And on the opposite end, what would you say were some of your strengths or favorite parts of what you did?
I really believe in the subject. And it was one of those things where I could have spoke for, instead of 40 minutes, or I could have spoke for an hour and a half because of all the different things I'd like to share about the topic. So it wasn't a topic I was only a little interested in. It was one I'm very interested in. And so that helped, pull me forward because I felt this could be really helpful to people. The other piece is the podcast, as we're doing here today, that has helped me get a little more comfortable with speaking in front of a virtual audience, because that's one of those things too. And I'm sure you've seen this in your work and performance, that it is somewhat easier when you're in front of a live audience because you can gauge it. It's a little harder in the virtual world, but because I have done some work in the virtual world and I work on Zoom and stuff like that, that part of it I was probably more familiar with than some people might have been.
Sure.
It was quite a growing and interesting learning experience. And
I got to share, I mean, your audience probably knows this already, but if you don't know Lynn personally or professionally, the guy is just a charmer. Just talking to the guy is so easy and so flowing, and he makes you feel comfortable in what you're doing because he's got such a nice voice. His tone is good. He's got good conversational skills. He listens. It's all those things that come together. And that's what made it so easy to work with you, because you actually just are a good human being. And that's something I think a lot of us can learn from you, is that just be a nice human and do the work that you're asked to do. And things will really start to come together much easier and much better for you. And was it perfect? By all means, no. But was it better than what you probably expected? I would guess for you, yes.
it was, because I don't think of it, because it's just part of me. Just as you have said, I've had many other people say that I am comfortable to talk with. And it's something I don't even notice because I'm not really intentionally doing it. It's just part of who I am. But I remember once a person gave me some feedback and said, Lynn, you'd be a great person to take a vacation with because you're easy to talk to. I go, okay. I'd like to be someone you'd like to buy something from too, but so.
I think a lot of people hear those kinds of things and we usually dismiss them. We're just like, yeah, okay, thank you. That's a nice compliment. Where what they're telling you is a signal, like, use that. That's one of your strengths. This is going to help you resonate with a lot more people when you can use the things that people are telling you you're really good at. That's going to be one for you, is just your easy, nice conversational skill.
The other thing that I noticed is I've always worried about like my voice, and I'm sure it could be better, but I don't have that radio voice like you and other people have had that have done this kind of stuff for years. But I guess I can get past that. The fact that I don't have that deeply resonant radio voice, I can still be effective with people in doing webinars and conversation.
So here's what I'm going to tell you is I disagree with that, because you have such a really good radio voice. It is unique. Do you know who Sterling Holloway is by chance?
I don't.
He's the guy who voiced Winnie the Pooh in the Disney cartoons from years ago. But it's such a nice, easy voice to listen to. And that's a strength of yours for sure. Get that Sterling Holloway feel from your voice. And maybe that's why I'm so comfortable listening to you, because maybe it reminds me of my childhood or something. I don't know, but it's such a good thing for my ears to hear.
Okay, interesting. I guess I don't have to have the voice of Zeus or something from above.
That's what a lot of people think, right? We think if you have a radio voice, you're supposed to sound like this. And no, that is not what we want. We want you to be just you in a nice conversational human way. And you do that outstandingly.
So I was thinking, Rick, we've talked about what I did here. Thoughts in general that you just might share with the audience about things to consider when they're getting ready to present. We've talked about what you did with me. Any other thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
I think the most important is know your audience. So if you can find out more about who they are, what their challenges are, like what's keeping them up at night, whether it's professionally or personally, then we can start connecting with them on a level that they know that we know they're in pain and they have stuff that we can help them with. So then we're going to give them the answers and provide the value that they're looking for. And we want to build that know, like, and trust factor, that KLT factor that helps them trust us a lot more. So they do want to come back to us and find more answers. And I'd say the other thing is Webinars are different than a live presentation, and a live presentation is different than a team meeting of sorts, whether it's virtual or in person. So there's a lot of different ways to approach whatever kind of presentation you're giving, but know what the strengths are in each and what the weaknesses might be. So in a webinar like what you did, we talked about how the story is not as engaging for an audience. We might want to hit on it a little bit, but that's not going to be the spotlight, where we might spotlight that story in a live keynote presentation, because that's really going to springboard what we're going to talk about in our content. So there's just different approaches, but we have to know our audience and know what kind of presentation we're giving and what makes sense and what we use.
Now, I know there's other aspects of the work you do, and I remember attending one of your workshops on networking. And without going through a whole presentation, what are the things you help people do as far as that one-on-one networking thing?
Yeah, I like to approach it in 3 steps, like the pre-game, the during the game, and post-game. So think about some things you can do before, like research the people you want to meet and focus on helping instead of selling yourself. Because a lot of people go to a networking meeting and they just feel like they're going to be sold to in a really gross fashion. So find the personal connections you can make. And so when you get to the event, talk more about your personal side, not just your professional side. Because as soon as we hear, "Hi, I'm Steve and I'm an accountant," a lot of people will tune Steve out because we already have an accountant, or accountants are boring, or anything like that. Where if we can find ways to say, "Hi, I'm Steve, and next week I'm going on vacation to Paris." And it's like, whoa, tell me more about that, Steve. That sounds really cool. So little things like that make a difference in how we approach networking is really going to be awesome. And another few tips, have a business card. And when you receive one, you can write notes on the person about what you learned from them on the back of them. You don't have to do it right in front of them as they're talking to you writing. We're not doing that. But as soon as you're done, find a nice, safe place to go and just write a few things about the person you just met, so you can remember what they said. And then you can email them, call them, whatever it is, and ask about, "Hey, how are your kids doing? You said you had 2 kids, and just checking in on how they're doing. You had a baseball game they were doing. Did they win?" Things like that are going to build that trust and relationship with somebody we meet. And then, of course, afterwards, follow up. We do have to do the work of following up with somebody and making sure they know that we remember who they are, because otherwise, out of sight, out of mind happens in a lot of networking functions.
All right. Thank you for that, Rick. That's something the audience can put right into practice, even if they're not ready to do a webinar. But as you talk, it's interesting. The skills sound a little bit, the same as preparing for a webinar.
Yeah. I mean, it's human behavior, right? We're all humans, and we got to find a different way to approach and break the routine. We get stuck in our routines. And so we have to shake things up a little bit. Otherwise, we just become like everybody else. And when we're like everybody else, we don't stand out in somebody's brain. So we have to find a way to do that.
Any other thoughts you'd like to share as we wrap up this session?
I'll just encourage everybody to check out your webinar, Lynn. I'm sure you can tell them where to find it, but my goodness, you did such a great job for a first webinar. You have to understand that it's not going to be perfect and how we want it to be right out of the gate. We're going to find things that we could have worked on or changed and all that kind of stuff. But from where you started to where you ended up, Lynn, it was outstanding. You just really did a fantastic job. And I would wish that anybody else who comes to me asking for help with a webinar would do the kind of work that you did, because it was just so cool to see.
And Rick, I will have your contact information shared in the show notes and stuff. Davis Presentation Group is your company?
Yeah, Davis Presentation Group. And if anybody's interested, I'm offering a 30-minute profitable presentation session where we can talk about what you're wanting to do. And I can give you some pointers and tips. And if you can use them, great. If you want to work further, we can talk about some options for that too. I'm just here to help however I can. And if anybody wants to reach out for their profitable presentation session, you can email me at rick@davispresentationgroup.com with a subject line, "No more boring."
I'll just share with people that while Rick and I are in the same geographic area, everything was done virtually because of whatever circumstances. Rick may love to work with you in person. He's also a great one to work with, even if it has to be virtual.
You got it.
Rick, I thank you much. And appreciate all your help in my development and this webinar development. And it's just great to know you. And I'm sure we'll work together in the future.
I can't wait, Lynn. You did such an awesome job, and I'm anxious to see where you're going next.
Again, our thanks to Rick for sharing another great way for people to have encore careers and to get their message across in a great way. Here are the steps we covered in this episode. Rick and the work that he does, the journey that Rick and I went on building the webinar, how he helped me use story for the presentation, how he helped me to focus on the audience even though it was virtual, and that bonus that I mentioned, some key tips on networking. So please refer to the show notes for the references to Rick and how to reach him. And as always, I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode as you start exploring the ideas in this episode. Also, you'll find in the show notes a link to the replay of my recent webinar on 4 questions that will improve your encore career selection. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.